Welcome back, guys, to Cool Runnings Chess. And today we're going to be looking at imbalances in your position and how to spot the imbalances so they can win more games and increase your lead. So, what are imbalances? Imbalances is a difference between your position and your opponent's position, right? So, how do we spot these imbalances? We have several imbalances. So let's list them. The first one is material. So that's whether you're up in an extra pawn, up a piece, up an exchange. So that's the first one, right? The second one is piece activity or piece mobility, right? How active is your piece or how active is your opponent's piece in the game? Okay. The third one is pawn structure, right? So the pawn structure is whether your opponent has double pawns, isolated pawns, pawn islands, or a pass pawn, where this is for yourself as well. So when you in the pawn structure or in the when you have a pawn structure, you always want to make a pawn structure very good, right? So you don't want double pawns or isolated pawns, but sometimes you're going to have these pawns in your games. That doesn't mean that, oh, I have a double pawn, so I'm going to lose them. No, right? So you always want to try and attack weak pawns when the pawn structure, if the pieces start to get traded off in the endgame, you always want to attack the weak pawns. The next one is space. This is just who has more space or who has more squares, controlling more squares. Whether your opponent is controlling more squares in your half of the board or you're controlling more squares in your opponent's half of the board, right? The next one is king safe. This is whether your king or your opponent's king is safe or unsafe. King safety is very important in your games in terms of balances. If my king is safe and my opponent's king is unsafe, it's way easier to attack that king more so than my king to get attacked. I will reach his king faster than how he reaches my king. Okay, the next one is piece quality, whether your pieces are good or they're bad pieces. We spoke about this in our last video, so you can go and watch that. But the piece value, the piece quality means that if your bishops are on long diagonals looking at way across the board, if they're good bishops, they're bad bishops, if your knight is on an outpost. Also, if your rook is able to get on an open file, half open file, if it's able to get on the seventh rank or the second rank based on which color you play. And the last one is initiative or tempo. So what is tempo or initiative? It's basically who's forcing the other to react, right? So if you're forcing your opponent to react every time you move a piece, that is as you gain a tempo or you have an initiative in your game. So today we're going to be looking at a game between two players, right? So the game starts off with white playing pawn to d4, black responds with pawn to d6, white continues with knight to f3, black plays pawn to g6. Now white plays bishop to f4, and now we're in the London system. Black continues with bishop to g7, pawn to e3, pawn to a6. I'm not sure what that does. There's too much pushing of the pawns by black here. You already push 1, 2 pawns. You need to kind of get out your knight in the game. But let's continue. White is playing knight b to d2. Black plays knight d7, c3, pawn d4. Another pawn push. I guess black is just trying to take as much space as he can on the queen side and trying to get his bishop to d7 on this long diagonal right here. But let's continue. Okay, bishop to d3 is played by white, bishop to d7, as I said, trying to control the long diagonal. That is a good bishop right now. Very good bishop. Castle. So now we have one king is safe, but the other king is not really safe as yet. Knight f6, queen to c2, c5, and now a4. So white realizes that black is trying to take space, right? Trying to take space, trying to create an imbalance in the position, especially on the queen side. So white continues c4, bishop to e2. You do not want to lose your bishop, so you put it back. Knight to h5, trying to trade off this bishop and double the pawns. It's just trying to create an imbalance in the position. Remember, all the pieces are very what would I say now? All the pieces have been developed by white, right? So black is trying to trade off one of his bishops to have the bishop here and maybe to get, but white doesn't really want to give up the bishop that easily. Alright, white plays bishop to g5, black plays h6, he still wants to keep the bishop back, g5, and then bishop to g3. Now black is able to trade the bishops, and now white has double pawns. These double pawns are not that bad. They're not that bad. I remember we said that not all double pawns are that bad in the game, right? So black continues with e6, white takes space in the center of the board with pawn to e4. So this is very, very key in our game because you want to control these squares, restricting the knight from coming forward into the game. Right. Castle by black, sorry, getting his king to safety. Now white plays knight to h2. So why did white play knight to h2? One, white wants to probably start an attack on the black king because these pawns right here are too far advanced of the board. But it's going to take a little bit of while, but he wants to create an attack, a pawn storm, if you want to call it, where we're going to be using your pawns to basically be the front line of attackers first before you jump into your we call it minor pieces or your major pieces, right? Black plays pawn to f5. So black is pushing too many pawns on his king side, and he's weakening his king safety. Right? So we have to look at all the imbalances. Is the pieces look at the material. So the material is equal. Material is very equal. Look at the piece activity. This bishop is not really that active as this bishop here on this long diagonal. Also, the knights are not really in the game right now. Black knight is not really in the game. This bishop is okay. The rooks are connected, but they're not really on any open file or half open file. The white queen is more active, I would say, than the black queen. But let's continue. Pawn to f4, trying to create an open lines onto the black. So knight to b6 was played. I'm guessing knight to b6 is attack the pawn and trying to do something with the knight. I'm not sure. So a5 was played. So that's an imbalance right there. Remember, taking initiative, taking more space on the queen side for white, and also getting a tempo to kick black's knight out from b6. Right, so knight was played back to d7, so he just wasted a move. Right, so he just forces the opponent to react and go backwards when he wanted to go forward. Right, white took on f5, trying to open the lines. Black took back with this pawn, trying to close this king because he doesn't really want this light square diagonal to open up for the white queen. Now, white plays this move, bishop to f3. Why did white play bishop to f3? This bishop is stronger. We talk about piece quality, right? This bishop on b7 is a good bishop, even a great bishop for black. And once you realize your opponent has a good piece and your piece is not as good as it, you want to trade off that piece equally so that you get rid of that good piece. That piece is looking too much into white's half of the board. So white wants to trade off his bishop that's not really doing much right now for that great bishop. Now black plays d5. So what did black do? Black plays d5 and we went from having a great bishop to not bad bishop because that bishop is stuck getting too many pawns on the light square. Remember, it's a light square bishop. It needs the light square. Now, white continues with pawn to g4. What is pawn to g4 do? Remember, we talk about king safety, right? And black king has too many lines open up over there. And the pawns have been pushed, and white king is way much more safer right now than the black king. Black captures, bishop capture on g4, and now pawn captures on f4. Yes, white is down a pawn. White is down in material. But what does white have? Initiative in the game. White has an imbalance and it's initiative in the game. White's bishop is better than black's. His knights are not really better than black's knight, but now they have squares. Now, king is not really safe, and queen is way better than black's queen. Rook to a to e1. Remember, rooks like open files. No, the pawn on a5 isn't free because the queen is tied on to protect the knight on d7. The knight went to b8. That is a bad, very bad. The knight should have went to f6 to put pressure on the bishop here. Reason being, f6 is just a way more is just a more active square for the knight, more so because the knight can then look to jump into a square like e4 and then try to at least make the bishop on b7 a bit better. But knight b8 doesn't really do much, and it locks in this rook, locks in the rook on a8. Rook can't really get into the game quick enough, and he's just going backwards instead of forward, right? So knight finally getting the d knight into the game. Maybe want to play it to e5, because remember, you want to get your pieces active. Active pieces, that's an imbalance as well. Once you have a more active pieces than your opponent's pieces, you're going to be having an advantage in your games. Knight to c6, bishop to e6 check, and now the king only has this one square over here. So now you have to see this. Imagine if I could play 1-2 moves here, right? And the king has to come up, and I just play a discovered attack, or maybe here, and then now I am able to play queen here, queen to h7 checkmate. This king is very weak, right? The light squares are very weak for the king, right? Because white is controlling all of the light squares right now, especially the king, and that's an imbalance in the position. Let's see what white does. White continues with knight to g4. Maybe wants to play his queen to g6, but doesn't want the rook to come here to fork his pieces, and maybe he wants to sacrifice his knight on h6. Bishop to c8. Remember, we'll talk about this bishop is way better than this bishop on c8 right now. So he wants what he wants. He wants to trade off his bad bishop for white's good bishop. Remember, we always talk about piece quality and piece activity. Queen to g6. He trades them, and now look at what we have here. The reason why white didn't trade is because this a6 pawn is going to be weak, this knight is under attack, and you're always looking to play knight takes h6. So you're going to try and win back your pawn. Yes, even though the knight can take here and go up, black can go up two pawns in material, the knight taking here is going to be so much more troublesome for black. Black plays knight e7, attacking the queen. Queen goes back to h5, still maintaining the attack, the double attack of the pawn. Rook to f5, then queen to h4, pinning the knight and putting pressure on the knight 2 times. Knight back to g8, queen trades. Why did white trade? You might say, white didn't need to trade, but the trade is very key here. Remember we talked about attacking weak pawns. This pawn on a6 is now weak, and now white can create what we call a pass pawn. Remember, pass pawn can be very crucial for us going into the end game. Now we're going into an end game. So now white captures the pawn on a6. Black continues with knight to f6. Now here we have to look and say, where does the rook go from? The rook is kind of stuck. It only has one square right now. Yes, black wants you to trade. Black wants the knight to trade. After rook takes back, and then they challenge the rook, and so on and so forth. But white doesn't need to do that. White plays knight to h4. If you take the knight here, I'll take your rook. So it's going to be up an exchange. So black continues rook to h5. Now we can win a piece here. And I want you to stop, think about it, and see what is the move here to win a piece for white. I give it 5 seconds. Okay, for those who found the move, yes, the move is knight check. Knight to g6 check. Knight to g6 check. Now you take the knight from out of the rook's attack, and also you're now attacking this knight twice, and he only has one defender. king plays to h7, knight takes check. That is very important because the king cannot take on g6. Well, it can take on g6, but then you're going to just take it's a 4, right? Bishop takes, rook takes. Now you're protecting the knight. Also, you're attacking this pawn. You're attacking an isolated pawn, which is weak. And now you're up a piece. And once you're up in material, you want to start looking to trade. So that now the knight is being attacked twice by the king and the rook. You only have one protector. Get the knight up, get the knight to safety, and now you're going to start looking to roll your passed pawn down the board. That is the simple idea. B4 was played. Now that's a free pawn. You have to say to yourself, there's nothing protecting the pawn. That's just a free pawn. And black sacrifices rook for the knight, and this is just winning here for white. You just play the rook to d6, and you realize all the imbalances, and after black captures, white captures, and then this is just simple calculation. You can capture here, you can do anything you want. You can play rook captures here, and after pawn captures on b2, you play rook d1 to stop the pawn from queening on b1, or after rook captures on d4, if the pawn plays to c2, you just play rook behind the pawn on c4, sorry. And you can simply capture the pawn on c3, and if the pawn captures back, then you play rook to c4, stopping the passed pawn. And if pawn captures on c3 and pawn to d3, you just play rook to d4, and the pawn will be stopped, and this pawn will be promoted in 2 moves. So white captures, and after here, black resigns the game. So remember, imbalances, those are the several imbalances you can look for in positions to help you win the game. Remember, the first one is material. Is the position equal? It means that do we have equal material on the board? Do we have equal amount of bishops, pawns, and queens and rooks on the board? The next imbalance you look in your position is piece activity. Is my piece active enough? Is my piece doing the best of its ability? Is my bishop on long diagonals, controlling long diagonals, right? Is my knight on an outpost? Is my rook on open files, right? And the next one is pawn structure. We just saw it in this position where pawn structure is very, very crucial. Once you have isolated pawns, it can be a hindrance in the end game for you, but it also can help you depending on the position that you have, right? Also, you want to attack weak pawns in the end game, and you always want strong pawn structures. So you always want the pawns connected. You want the passed pawn on the board, and attacking weak pawns. You saw in the pawn chain that we had here, for what black had here, it was so easy to attack the pawn on a6 once the rook had moved. Once the black rook had moved. The next one is king space. How many squares are you controlling on your enemy's half of the board, pushing them back? Okay. Next one is king safety. We realize that because black opened so many he did so many pawn pushes on his king side, he left his king in a vulnerable state that white could attack his king very, very easily and getting his pieces very, very easily. You realize that white king hadn't moved not once in the game other than castling. It was very, very totally safe. Black didn't even sniff looking at white's king, getting close checkmate at all on white's king. The next one is piece quality. Is my piece good? My piece bad? That's the next thing that we need to look for. And the last one is initiative or tempo. You need to ask yourself, am I forcing my opponent to react to my moves? When we played pawn to a5, sending the knight back to d7, right? As soon as the knight went to d6. So you have to look for tempos in the game. Remember, tempos can come in many forms. It can be you attacking a checkmate. It can be you. Remember, we did the knight. We carry back. Yes, in this position here. So you realize that your knight is undefended, but you don't want to trade, right? And you realize this rook can't go anywhere, and this rook is undefended. So what did you do? You played knight to h4, getting an initiative and a tempo. Yes, the knight. If the rook had went to g5, you would have captured here, and you would have won a piece. But that is the reason of tempo, because you had to find that tempo to gain the knight or gain the material that you need to win the game. And once you're up in material, you can start trading down to get to the end game, which is going to be so much more easy as we saw in this game to win once you're up in material. So guys, that's how we plan our that's how we know our imbalances in the game. That's the several imbalances. Once you're playing your game, you need to stop, ask yourself these imbalances, and you will figure out and you will win the game much more easier. Guys, like, share, and subscribe.